In this podcast, we are going to discuss cost and cost data. I guess it's kind of relevant for cost managers and quantity surveyors, but actually it's quite relevant for a lot of different stakeholders.
And it's very relevant if we take into account how our profession is shifting and how we are also leaning into data analytics as part of our a new role or a new task that we will be performing as cost specialists. So what is a data analyst without data?
A person, I guess, right? Yeah. So I think we're going to discuss, first of all, what is cost data? How can we collect the data on our projects? What value will or does that data have? And then really the future, what is the future for, I guess, the collection, the data and everything around the information? But so what is cost data in your mind, Elia?
Cost data is cost data. It is in my mind. It's not just what it is, cost data, but how we set up data. So the most important thing in my mind is to have a structured data, because that's what really brings quality and understanding and accuracy to that data. Cost data is the monetary values of your project, not at final account, actually at as many different stages as it is available, because that's what will make us understand how the cost data evolve.
So when we talk about structure then within our profession, I guess we like to talk about global standards and global structures. So cost data needs a structure behind it. So
reason being we are talking about global standards is because in our specialization we produce very little data. Specifically, if we limit it to, or if we look only at the monetary, the
financial or
the cost values, right? Is we produce very, very little. So if we are trying to really compare it, benchmark it, and we limit that data to one company, one location, one national standard, that is a very, very small data set with very little accuracy if we are trying to analyze that.
The smaller the data set, the less accurate it is, the bigger it is, the better it is.
The larger it is, the more you understand how it fluctuates and what is accurate and what is actually a deviation.
Right now, you could say that we don't produce big data in the context of big data when we talk about
definitely not.
Google Maps and this, and also when our cost data is collected over actually quite a long period of time if you consider the project life cycle from inception to construction and handover, or even if you're talking about operational cost. We go from a design of 1 or 2 years, a construction of 1 or 2 years, and an operation of 30 or 50 years. So really, the cost data collection is a very slow process, meaning we need to be looking at a global scale here in order to get as much information as possible out of our industry.
And if on top of that you take into account that in that data set or in that very little data we are producing, if we are not using we are not disciplined enough to actually use a proper standard and being sure that the data is structured, then out of that very little data we produce, there will be a lot of data that we cannot use at all because it's not accurate or it's misleading or it's wrong. And this will be only talking like if we try to put names to these data sets, right? We could call it budget, we could call it estimate at different design stages. We could call it, or we should call it, variations, change orders, risk analysis, monthly valuations. Every piece of data that is produced in the project with a monetary value
has a data value for us as cost managers, quantity surveyors now.
It should be collected, and it should be collected, more importantly, following the same standards, so that you can actually compare it and align it to make advantage of it.
So for us as cost managers, we look at the global standard of ICMS, which is International Construction Measurement Standards. And that standard allows you to structure your cost information in a very particular way. And it's not, and something we need to say here, of course, it's not just building cost. It's not just the building. It is all the indirect costs and client costs. All your project costs is what we look at here, not just the cost of the facade. So that standard allows us to collect that cost information. And if we use that standard on every project, and more particularly on every phase of every project, it allows us to collect quite a bit of information, as we mentioned earlier on. And once we have that data set, which is your project information, in a structured way, then you can analyze projects against each other. What is the major cost drivers on office construction in Copenhagen? What are the major cost drivers in residential construction, apartment, multi-use construction in Dublin, for example?
And it's important to mention that this specific standard ICMS and the recent version ICMS 3 is actually planned and theorized to actually cover not only CapEx, which is something that we are more familiar with, but actually all the life cycle costs of a project, which we will very soon need to report and track. And therefore, we need to be prepared for that.
Absolutely.
It also allows you to track properties of your project information, because it's not just the value of the elements that you have in your CapEx definition of the design, it's all the external factors that affect the cost of it, and they need to be taken into account in analytics.
So location is
For
a
example,
factor. Location would be a factor.
Location, it is rural, it is urban, where it is placed, how are the conditions of your soil, is an earthquake area, all those like time, right, and country, like it's many different external factors that have an effect in your cost, including procurement strategies.
And contracts and so on. So it's not just about the unit price. Actually, it's about collecting the project information that has a commercial impact in a structured way, so that it can be categorized and cataloged, so that we can analyze it later. There's an example would be is you can look at a square meter price for developments in Copenhagen, because that's where we're sitting today. But those developments can be vastly different. Some could be residential, some could be schools, some could be universities. They could be lecture halls or laboratories or sports halls. All of that has a different influence, as well as location.
In the harbor, or they could be built in the rural areas, right, where no logistics are accessible, or where you are building over the water, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
And how these properties change actually on the different estimates, because the initial settings,
case,
if you call it like on a software. So the initial definition of your project may change along the different design stages or the life of your project.
After inception, you might end up needing a basement, for example, and suddenly your commercial and cost information changes, but so does the properties, as you say, of the development. And it's important to understand those changes, to understand the data that you're collecting.
So do the building regulations or the procurement strategy might change also in the middle of the project? Why not? This
We're seeing it at the moment with sustainability and the requirements around sustainability. Again, a very big word in terms of its influence and deliveries on the project, and we'll talk about that in another podcast. But embodied carbon and how we collect and calculate that information has a commercial impact, has a cost impact on your project. So all of these elements are needed to be collected. So I think you've defined quite well what is cost data. It's not just the Danish kroner, the dollar, the pound, the euro. It is much more than that. And how we structure that, I think we have talked a bit about. ICMS, we would absolutely promote as a global standard, especially for quantity surveyors and cost managers, or even our clients listening this evening. It is important for them to understand there is a standard to work to.
And how we structure not that just one point of the project, more importantly, how we define that standard to go across your entire life, the entire life of your project, the entire portfolio, but specifically in the entire project. Something we see often is that because there is different stakeholders involved, taking over or handing over, the practices of these new stakeholders are applied, and so the entire project data structure changes. This should not be allowed anymore. Now that we understand the value of this would be one of the requirements in the project, meaning this should be defined on the BIM execution plan and the common basis for your project and how the data is produced, structured, and defined.
So your 5D dimension within your BIM execution plan suddenly becomes an awful lot more structured and more defined. Often in BIM execution plans, we see that there is no definition for the fifth dimension, which inevitably is a data set, a lot of information as we just discussed. So it needs to be predefined, which is why we talked earlier about the QS being part of the project from the beginning. So cost data, again, is a very important part of the project. We're a little biased, but nevertheless it is, because budgets and CapEx are hugely important to make the business, run. But how do we collect this information then? If we have the structure ICMS, how or when do we collect this information on the project?
We really need to include this as part of the process, ideally making it easy. So if we are working on a different standard or with a different breakdown, and then we just try to collect it afterwards, that's never going to happen, because it requires time involved and dedication and discipline, and most likely the people collecting the data are not necessarily seeing the immediate value of doing so, and so there is no motivation, right? There is no encouragement. So the best is to actually set this standard and force it across all the information produced from the 5D.
So make it part of the project deliverables and the day-to-day working on the project. So you again said earlier on, even a change management or a variation is valuable cost information or cost data. So the collection of that is even important. So it's not a case of, as you mentioned, collecting the final account. It's understanding at a cost estimate update that data is collected so we can analyze the differences between the current cost estimate, the previous cost estimate, the budget, for example. And that principle should be through the entire project life cycle. Every change and every update is a new revision and new information.
And as I was saying, maybe the person collecting this data is not immediately in favor of it, so they don't see the immediate value of it. Now, it is appreciated when you are looking back to benchmarking. So the main stakeholder that will benefit the most from it is actually the clients themselves, the developers, the owners of these properties or these projects, because it's them who will be able to actually analyze and compare all this data across their different projects, their different locations, their entire portfolio.
I would argue that the professional quantity surveying practice also will see this data as invaluable, because as part of their profession, they're advising on early stage benchmarking, business cases, and so on. So, remove opinion, base it on data, start collecting, start standardizing. But how do we collect this data on the project? We now know that we can standardize. We now know that every change is a new revision. But how do we collect that then? Do we use is it software? Is it PDF? Is it Excel? How do we work with this information?
Ideally, I'd say a readable format, so not a dead format. So if you collect information in a PDF, that will require processing later. So either you process it if you have been very disciplined, and in your PDF, the data is always in the same position and in the same areas, right?
The same text.
You could teach a machine learning, to actually read it and extract it, to collect it elsewhere in a database, right? But why not to do that now? I mean, the technology is already there. It's just changing the way we work. Potentially that PDF is produced from an Excel. Excel is not a database, but is a format that allows us to produce information that can be read. So it is about maybe implementing the automatic flows, if you want to call it like that, to continue working on the regular tools, but actually ensuring that the information we are producing there can be exported elsewhere, correct? And ideally, we'll be using databases. I think that collecting information in an Excel sheet is not good enough. These days. Databases are accessible. They are very easy to get through. There is a lot of softwares out there actually that provide this.
And I think that for anybody listening at looking to transition into data collection and so on, there's a lot of value in looking at how you do it right now and the process around it, but also the standards you use. And it seems a bit daunting at the beginning, but we would always advise pick one project at a time and just start on that project. Even if you're not contractually obliged to do it, it will become a professional requirement to advise your client that it should be done, even if they don't see the value right now. But that leads us nicely into, I guess, the next point, which is cost data and the value of cost data. And we could mean value in a monetary sense, because there will be a value for it in the future.
The more accurate, the more you can nail your estimates, the more investors can really invest or allocate their investments in a better way, right? Not to having projects under budget or over budget or with loaded contingencies. If you are able to analyze and predict with certain accuracy, because you are basing it in data and statistics, statistical methods of analytics. How is your contingency normally used? How much contingency you use? How much a project changes from inception till final account? So number of variations, the risk allowances, the changes due to quality on the design and development and needs and etc. Right? How your project a commercial shift. If we are able to analyze that and predict that based on data, that will really be very valuable for everybody to be more accurate.
Yeah, and it's even on the project itself, understanding the impact of change on the project is driven by the collection of cost data in a structured way. We become much more transparent on our projects and much more kind of proactive towards our clients and the advice that we're giving them on the project. So the value of cost data is not just for benchmarking in the future, but it's also on the projects itself.
It allows you to improve the process of how you address a project. So, for example, by having proper tags and naming conventions and naming your stakeholders, maybe you can start analyzing which of your stakeholder groups are requesting the most changes or are creating the most impact to the economics, so that in your next project or on your projects you can actually focus on managing that group specifically, maybe by defining those requirements at earlier stage, so that you impact least the less in later stages their requirements, their needs. It might also allow you to understand where your real costs happen, because it may not be an obvious cost driver at the beginning, but it actually may impact a lot substantially the project economics in the end.
And your decision making. One simple thing is getting cost data from the marketplace or the industry. So structuring your bills of quantities or cost breakdown structures so that you collect that cost data from the industry gives you a very clear insight into the current position of the industry at that time. But what it also does is gives you an understanding of the quality of the price and offer you're receiving from the contractor or the supply chain. And that's all cost data. If you look across 5 contractors at a particular unit within the building, and you can see that, for example, if it is a ventilation system and it's a AHU unit, and one contractor is 100 or 200% above or indeed below the other contractors, it raises a question about why, and that offers an opportunity to ask. So cost data, again, is not just about the collection of the project, it's also about facilitating the process and project qualities, we would say, on the project.
And we've talked about this before, but every change in every discipline actually has an impact on the cost aspect of it. So if we change the time plan, it will have an effect on cost. So actually have access or enabling the collection of data in other disciplines also allows you to understand change in a cost, right?
Yeah.
Variations. For example, if consistently your procurement process delays the entire signature of
the contract.
signing the contract, right? Because there is always complications about it. Like that normally we all know, but we rarely remember because that data is not really tracked and highlight with a warning on this is something you need to focus on your next project because this has this amount of money impact to it.
And if we were to, in the simple terms, I would say that for clients and for investors, just understanding the square meter price of a building at the earlier stage is hugely important for decision making. And decision making to invest is generally quite quick. It can be very aggressive, depending on where you're buying your land or your project and so on. And having that cost data in that sense becomes very valuable. Another area of having valuable cost data is when we look at price inflation and the movement of prices in the market. We've all experienced over the last number of years COVID impact, global supply chain impact. Having that structured cost information on a project allows you to understand and isolate certain materials or certain elements of the project so that you can have a clearer image of what the potential impact of this is going to be. For example, if we can't get access to steel, what will that have? What will that have in my project if the current design is steel? It can be isolated, it can be calculated, and all of that becomes cost data and relevant cost data.
And I think that in that regard, and since we have also emphasized before, maybe the way other disciplines collect their data needs to be evaluated from a cost perspective. Yeah. Because for us as cost specialists, it is very, very important, or it will be very, very important to understand how the doors design change from inception till the end. So it increased on 30% from what you see on concept, or what is the amount of each material that is built in a project. For that, the other disciplines need to be tracking their data like in a structured way as well. So they would need to track materials as one separate, like as one separate parameter, right, on the property set of the way they are tracking the data. That data is rarely shared or available actually for design teams themselves to build databases of understanding the development or their design, and also for us cost managers to actually understand the variation from in percentage, right, in numbers of how the design changes from the beginning till the end, which will be very, very valuable, I think, for us to understand allowances, provisional allowances, and how to fill in the gaps of what is in the design, particularly on the 3D, for example, at different stages.
And another one, I would say, a value that we can achieve or we can get from the cost data is really challenging the design solutions, and not just design solutions nationally, but design solutions across borders. Maybe there's a lot of learning to happen. And really the first question is raised about how much does a building cost per square meter? And we can begin to analyze that across borders if we have standard structures, of course, around the economy, that how come my superstructure for an office building in London is way more expensive or cheaper than it is in Copenhagen or Dublin or New York, and begin to look at the design solutions around that superstructure so that we can then create more value, not only cost value, but value in the project for clients. And generally a good cost structure with cost data begins to drive that discussion point.
And something I've seen in projects that is probably the wrong approach. It's not as easy as coming saying, "Oh, I don't want a concrete building anymore. How about building it in timber?" For several reasons. What cannot happen is that we just change the entire structure, the material, right, the geometry from concrete to timber, and that's it. Because we also need to understand the implications, structural loads, etc., of changing from one to another, plus all the extra material that might need or extra properties that might be needed, acoustics or fire protection or services that can no longer be compatible from concrete to timber, right? And all that is either you design two totally different projects and then you compare them, or actually you evaluate them based on benchmark data from other projects. First, normally the main reason clients approach they want to know the cost implication of these changes, right? And without involving a full redesign, we could assess the difference in cost by actually having a better data benchmark to define the deviations between a concrete building and a timber building.
So really the value and cost data is driving quicker and I would say more accurate decision making from a client's perspective, meaning that they are reducing their risk, they're reducing time impact on the change, and of course they're reducing their potential cost impact.
And our sentences, right? Because it will be informed decisions based on facts, based on numbers and actual figures.
Yeah. That leads us into our last part, which is the future of cost data. I have one reflection, and this was a discussion I had recently about open source information and the view of, I would say, the majority of people in the industry that cost data is extremely confidential and extremely, I would almost say private, if you like, to the organizations that own it. But when we talk about this high-level cost analytics or anonymized cost analytics, then it's not really the data, I would say, that personal or that private data isn't really shared. But what you're doing is facilitating more accuracy within the industry. And I think that is where the future of this is going. I think we will be sharing more information, but sharing it in a kind of anonymized way, so we can't really understand that the cost data that I'm using, or part of the cost data I'm using, is yours, LA, or it's Cosmos's, or it's whoever's out there in the marketplace.
We need to face it with a similar approach as GDPR regulations right now. So in a recent conference in the BIM Summit recently, someone in the audience was questioning why, how have you been able to collect data with sensors from the different social housing apartments to actually provide a better experience for the users without really compromising their privacy, because you will know if they use heating, you will know when are they home because they switch on the lights, when are they not home on vacation, if they take vacation. So you really are accessing their lifestyles, which is privacy, right? But the solution is really to anonymize that data input as soon as it is collected. It is about creating it as individual number one, individual number two. And it will be a similar approach with project economy. It's confidential and it's sensitive as long as you can put it a name to it. You can identify it. Who is that person? Who is that building project, right? Who is that company? But if we look at it as a more from more like a
generic, maybe is probably a stronger word.
In a generic way, but anonymous, that will be the solution to it. We all have benefit from the anonymous rating on restaurants and anonymous valuations and of
Google Maps,
at all levels, right?
Traffic,
Google Maps.
Traffic.
Exactly. What is the traffic? Like this road is having traffic jam. You get that data, you get benefit from that data
It's
However, you
anonymized.
don't know who's
driving the car.
that road.
Exactly.
So you don't know which project is over budget, or you don't know which project had very little doors at the beginning and very like many doors at the end, or who managed better their risk allowances. It's like we don't have such a unique projects that will compromise. So we have schools in Ireland, right? In a region, you have so many schools that it really will be difficult to accurately say this school has this, it was performing this bad because,
X, Y, and Z happened.
X, Y, Z,
but I would say that technically all public projects is public information. It's the private companies and the private investors that would be sharing their anonymized information. But also, you're right, the public authorities also should be sharing their information anonymized. So
there will be the main beneficiaries because in the end they are setting their public budgets, and it's a huge defeat if their budget was wrongly set up because they don't have a school for that season. Because they're over budget, problems, right? Like, and how many schools do regions build to actually understand the scope and magnitude and budget of these schools, right? So ideally, they should share this information between regions because they will be supported by previous experiences of other regions. Now, if it's we are ashamed because of performance or because disclosing,
I suppose
the goods and the bad.
It's like your fingerprint, right?
If we are ashamed for that, or we fear the consequences, which is also sometimes the reason why we are not so transparent or sharing so much, then maybe it's just a matter of making anonymous, but making available.
Yeah, and I think as we develop cost data and the value of cost data, the future absolutely is sharing. It's currently what we're doing on our projects driven by building information modeling and building information management. We're now integrating, collaborating, and we're sharing our knowledge and information so that we can improve cost management, architectural design, engineering. The same will happen on industry-wide scale as soon as we become more culturalized to this way of working. So I think that is the future for cost data from our perspective. At least that's what we're going to try and do anyway.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks very much for listening. There's a LinkedIn link below in the show notes. We would love to connect with you.
We hope you enjoyed it and have you with us in the next one. Thank you very much.